This episode of This Week Explained is brought to you by the good folks over at Fresh Roasted Coffee and Positively Tea. Okay, so let me tell you, I've been loving their coffee lately. They have this super fun coffee quiz on their website that helps you find the perfect blend. I took it, and it matched me with this smooth medium roast that's just so good. And if you're more of a tea person, don't worry. They've got you covered with Positively Tea. They've got everything. Organic, fair trade, single origin, you name it, they have it. Seriously, whether you're a coffee or tea drinker, you're going to find something you love. So, listeners, head over to the link in our show notes, click it, and it'll take you to a special offer on the coffee and tea. And when you get to checkout, use the promo code THISWEEK to get 20% off your first purchase. Welcome to This Week Explained, the podcast that cuts through the noise to help you make sense of our ever-changing world. I'm Tiana, and each week my co-host Kervin and I break down the biggest global events and explain what they mean for you. This week, we're diving into the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, Russia's plan to negotiate Iran's nuclear deal with the U.S., China's reaction to war with the U.S., and the unconfirmed reports that Cyber Command will no longer pursue offensive cyber operations against Russia. There is a lot of U.S. talk this week, so let's start with Ukraine. On March 3rd, U.S. President Donald Trump ordered a pause on military aid to Ukraine and followed that up with a pause in intelligence sharing. I want to explore what this means for Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and obviously the broader global order. So, Kervin, this is where you're coming in. What exactly happened and why is this pause so significant?
Yeah, look, we'll start with the pause, that pause in aid. That includes critical warfighting equipment. That's the artillery ammunition, armored vehicles, Patriot air defense batteries, and then long-range missile systems like the HIMARS and the ATACMS. And these are very sophisticated systems. They are pretty much systems that only the U.S. can supply. Now, France and Britain have some of their own, but they're not as precise as these. And they've been vital to Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. Now, the White House stated that the pause is actually to review whether Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is making a good faith effort toward peace negotiations with Russia. But they haven't really clarified what specific conditions Zelensky needs to meet for the aid to resume.
That probably means whatever we decide in the moment. Whatever tells us.
They've been asking for him to apologize publicly. So then he sent a letter to Trump to apologize and to thank you, which Donald Trump read some of it during his speech the other night.
In Congress.
And then shortly after that, they stopped intelligence sharing, which I will say...
So does that mean it wasn't a sufficient enough apology?
Right. What they are saying right now is they want Ukraine to come to the table in good faith. That's the term that they used.
Yeah, but also what does that mean?
Right. These are just terms that aren't tangible. They're arbitrary terms, or terms that we're talking about arbitrarily. So the one that gets to me the most or gives me pause the most is the stopping of intelligence sharing. And that's because it costs nothing. The U.S. is already doing it. Providing it to Ukraine, it
seems petty.
It is very petty. And it affects the battlefield immediately. A lot of the aid, the military aid, it's already there. Ukraine's already using it. They're not going to see
the push that Biden
They're not going to see the effects of that for another 3 to 4 months. The intelligence sharing is going to be immediate.
Well, obviously, that is a major shift in U.S. policy. So how is this likely to impact Ukraine's ability to defend itself?
Yeah, like I was talking about, it's not going to be immediate as far as the military aid is concerned. But in the medium to long term, it is a very serious concern. Ukraine relies heavily on U.S. aid. For example, they could very well run out of U.S.-provided artillery shells by May or June of this year. And their stockpile of Patriot air defense missiles could be depleted in, say, just a few weeks from now. Now, the loss of Patriot systems is particularly alarming. That coupled with the lack of intelligence sharing. Those systems form the backbone of Ukraine's air defense.
Like, they worked so hard to even acquire those.
Right. There was a lot of diplomatic discussions. And I will say, we talked about this last week with the kerfuffle, as I call it, that happened in the Oval Office. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of reports that came out over the last couple of years that those same conversations and the way that the conversation went down in the Oval Office is not unique to Trump and J.D. Vance. Biden himself, former U.S. President Biden himself, was very angry at times with the way that Zelensky was asking and continuously asking for more and more aid and wouldn't drop certain subjects.
Right.
So, like I always say, when we talk about this stuff...
we try to talk from all angles.
All angles. Right. And so now that happened publicly, the U.S. has got to do something.
Yeah, usually presidents try to put on some, decorum. Right. Whatever they're having, and the... Trump is, like you mentioned last week, whenever I was having my little emotional reaction, you mentioned last week that Trump is just doing probably what lots of leaders do behind the scenes.
Right. The problem is it happened in front of the media for all to see.
Right.
And J.D. Vance said, do not try to litigate this in the media. And what's interesting about that is now we're finding out that through General Kellogg, that the administration told Zelensky before the meeting happened, do not try to litigate this in front of the media. We'll sit down, we'll do a show, and we'll sign the paperwork, but do not try to get more out of the U.S. during this meeting. They think he tried to get more from the U.S., and so that is an add-on to the frustrations that they're feeling.
Well, that's also what you mentioned. You said we needed to wait for more details to come out about what actually happened instead of reacting to what initially was put out in the news.
Right, and with Trump in the news, it's always polarizing.
Yeah.
So people just seem to either love everything he does, absolutely, or hate everything he does, absolutely. And we can't work in absolutes.
Yeah.
Okay. And so now with all of that, Ukraine's not going to get this military aid. And without it, they're going to have to make some tough decisions about which population centers to prioritize for their own protection. If they run out entirely, major cities within Ukraine could be left vulnerable to devastating attacks.
Okay, so let's zoom out just a bit. How are other countries reacting to the pause in U.S. aid?
Well, I mean, I think they're doing what the Trump administration wanted them to do, which is stepping up more to do more.
Want more defense spending?
Exactly. Now, the European Commission has now proposed what they called the Rearm Europe plan. It's a comprehensive initiative to increase defense spending across EU members, and the plan could mobilize up to 800 billion euro. That's about $849 billion for defense investments, and that'll be over the next 4 years. Now, that includes funding for air and missile defense systems, artillery, drones. Drones are big in warfare now, and because drones are getting big, they need anti-drone systems. So all of that's grouped in there. Now, for Europe, this isn't just about supporting Ukraine. This war is on the continent of Europe. It's about strengthening Europe's long-term security.
It blows my mind that they weren't already doing this, honestly.
Well, that when you rely on one person or one entity or one country to provide most of the funding, you're going to stop because you're going to stop spending on your own defense. If you have the United States,
you're just banking on it, flowing indefinitely.
Right, and so what Europe did during this stretch where the United States spent what's probably 50 to 60% of the NATO budget was coming from the United States and another 20 from Germany, is Europe started to spend their money on social programs and safety nets and things to keep their, health care. And so we talk about how the healthcare system in Europe is cheaper. In the U.S., we have to spend a lot of money. That's not a discussion I want to get into here because it'll be angry. But Europeans pay a lot less for healthcare because they can. Because
so is that going to change now?
It's got to change. Yeah. It's going to have to change, or European countries are going to collapse under the weight of their own spending.
Okay, so Europe is obviously they're trying to fill the gap left by the U.S., the spending gap, but can they really replace what the U.S. provides? Because obviously our technology,
Right, and no, in the short term, no, there's no way that they can. Right now, we're just talking about Ukraine here. U.S. supplies about 30% of Ukraine's arsenal. Europe contributes another 30%, and then Ukraine itself is producing the remaining 40% of that. So that's 30% of the supplies that are gone now, not going to be supplied anymore. Now, while Europe's increased defense spending is a positive step, many of the advanced systems Ukraine relies on, like the Patriots, like the HIMARS and ATACMS, they're uniquely American. With that said, Ukraine has been ramping up its domestic defense production. We talked about their improvements in drone warfare. They've tripled artillery production. They've doubled anti-tank weapon production. And by the end of 2025, they hope to meet 50% of their military needs domestically. So that's a bump up of almost 10%. But for now, so that's the end of this year. For now, they're still dependent on foreign support to sustain this war effort.
All right, well, now let's talk about Russia. How is Moscow reacting to the pause in U.S. aid?
Well, look, obviously they're happy about it, but they're cautiously optimistic. Russian officials, including Dmitry Peskov, which is the spokesperson for the Kremlin, have framed the aid suspension as an opportunity for what he calls peace, quote-unquote peace, through their version of peace. Although their version of peace just means we want to get Ukraine to surrender.
Right.
Now, they're also using this moment to push for additional concessions from the United States. They want to end arms sales to Europe.
No.
There's a lot of talk about U.S. getting out of NATO. That is another Russian push to stop funding NATO.
Oh, geez.
And Russia also wants the U.S. to lift sanctions.
Which we would do if there was a peace deal.
Right. We talked to you.
Yeah.
We had this conversation weeks ago.
A couple times.
We keep talking about, don't lift sanctions on Russia. Well, that's going to be part of the peace deal.
Right.
To lift the sanctions. Now, how part of it's also going to be how are you going to repay or how are you going to rebuild Ukraine? Some of the funds that were captured by Europe and the United States.
Trump Plaza, Ukraine.
Well, yeah, we'll see about that.
I'm kidding.
But yeah, so a lot of those discussions are still on the table. And that's all going to come out in peace negotiations. Now, on the battlefield, I think Russia is going to exploit this pause. They did this similarly back in early 2024 when the U.S. paused some of their aid. Now, back then, they ramped up operations in areas like Avdiivka and Kharkiv, and they took advantage of Ukrainian supply shortages. Now, we're already seeing signs of increased Russian activity in eastern and southern Ukraine. There's intensified offensives in Kharkiv, Luhansk, even Zaporizhzhia.
So, obviously, this pause could embolden Russia to escalate its operations, especially since they know that America probably won't be sending.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. And their strategy has always been to grind down Ukrainian forces through high casualty, attritional warfare. That's why we've said a protracted war is a bonus for Russia. They're likely to use this pause to press their advantage, especially in areas where they've been trying to consolidate territorial claims.
Okay, well, let's shift gears to the diplomatic front. Zelensky has expressed a willingness to work with the Trump administration to achieve peace. So what is the status of those efforts?
Yeah, look, both Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament have reiterated their commitment to peace talks. Zelensky even proposed measures like a partial ceasefire, there'll be a ban on strikes against civilian infrastructure, and then a truce in the Black Sea. But Russia has no interest in meaningful negotiations right now, which is something I think people should press Trump about. If he is really doing these things to get both presidents to the table for lasting peace,
right?
Then
why isn't he pushing Russia to do the same thing that he wants Zelensky to do?
And maybe he says he is pushing Putin privately, make it public.
Yeah, make it public like he did with Zelensky.
Exactly, because what that does is improves morale for the Ukrainian military.
Right.
And it shows the world that the United States is not taking one side or the other. They're doing exactly what Trump has said, which is trying to broker peace between two nations.
So while Ukraine is extending an olive branch, Russia isn't budging. So what's the end game here? Trump has continued to blame Zelensky for not wanting peace. And like we said, supposedly he's talking to Putin privately about it. But we haven't seen anything about that.
No, that's not coming out at all. Now, for Russia, the end game is what it has always been, what we talked about from the very start of this war. He wants a complete conquest of Ukraine. And if you don't believe that, go back to 2022 with the initial push for Kyiv that failed miserably.
And he also said he flat out stated that he wanted to restore Mother Russia to its former glory.
Yep. Called out Ukraine and Finland,
right?
Which caused Finland to do what? Request NATO membership.
Yeah.
It's another conversation that I think people should stop having. I told this, I think I talked about this on NTD this week, that we keep talking about how NATO's pushing towards Russia's border. NATO's not pushing anywhere. Countries have to request to come into NATO, and then all NATO countries vote for it. So this isn't an offensive move. It's a purely defensive move, and I think that needs to come out in these conversations. Now, like we talked about the push for Kyiv early on, Russia does want all of Ukraine. If that doesn't work at first, like it didn't early on, they do want to secure enough leverage to demand significant territorial concessions for future negotiations. Now, for Ukraine, the goal is basically right now just to hold the line, buy time, and build up their domestic defense capabilities.
Well, thank you for that update. Now I want to get into the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, which has taken a dramatic turn with U.S. President Donald Trump issuing what he called a, quote, last warning, end quote, to Hamas. He's demanding the release of hostages held in Gaza. So let's start with the basics. What exactly did Trump say?
Yeah, well,
oh my gosh.
As Tiana's southern drawl gets out there.
That was not a southern drawl. That was just embarrassing, but I don't care. You can keep it in there.
Trump actually took to Truth Social, if we could talk in this episode.
And we even did warm-ups.
We did do
warm-ups. We tried to loosen our lips and get our tongues not stuck to the roof.
Sunk our ships.
It didn't work. So,
at all.
Or we need to change our vocal warm-up things.
That could be it.
Mm-hmm.
So Trump took to Truth Social, his favorite social media platform.
Because he created it.
Correct. And he delivered I would call a fiery statement. He warned Hamas to release all hostages immediately.
So not really taking the ceasefire agreement into consideration anymore. He just wants them out now.
He wants it to stop. He wants all hostages released right now.
Okay.
Or what he said, and I'll quote him here, quote, "It is over for you." Over was in all caps, end quote. He also threatened that, quote, "not a single Hamas member will be safe," end quote. That's if they don't comply. Now, Trump claimed he's going to send Israel, quote, "everything it needs to finish the job," end quote. Though, as Trump typically does, he did not specify what any of this entails.
Well, that is obviously some very strong rhetoric. Trumpurpally. So did he address the people of Gaza directly?
Oh, he definitely did. He had a sharp message with a combination of threat, but also promise.
For Gaza?
For Gaza, for the Palestinian people. He told the people of Gaza that a, quote, "beautiful future," end quote, as only Trump could say.
Yeah.
Beautiful future.
Beautiful future.
Could be theirs if the hostages are released. But he also didn't mince words. He warned that failure to comply from Hamas would mean, quote, "you are dead," end quote, all caps on the dead. Yeah.
Okay.
Just for a second, let's go back to Trump-verbally. And you could see what he says, or see what he says, read what he types, hear what he says, but that doesn't always amount to what he's actually going to do.
Okay, well, how has Hamas responded to this?
Well, they accused Trump of encouraging Israel to violate the current ceasefire agreement.
Well, he is.
Right. Now, a spokesman for the group, that's Hazim Hassim, he said Trump's threats complicate the situation. It emboldens Israel to avoid implementing the terms of the ceasefire.
What is confusing me about all of this is that the White House has just confirmed it's holding direct talks with Hamas. So obviously that's a little shift from what he was saying on Truth Social, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a confusing situation. And I do appreciate that you're pointing out this contradiction. Now, once again,
some stuff he likes putting it out in the open if he knows he'll be able to embarrass the other people.
And that's what he wants to do in public. We saw it with Zelensky.
Right.
And it's important to note that while these talks between the White House and Hamas aren't necessarily aligned with Trump's rhetoric, his administration is framing these negotiations as a practical, good faith effort to secure the release of American hostages. But that's really the release of the American hostages is what they're looking for. So the administration right now is taking a diplomatic approach that has not been tried by previous administrations. But Trump's statements seem more focused on projecting strength and then putting public pressure on Hamas.
I think you're absolutely right. Whenever you put it that way, it's easier to reel back your initial emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the goal of these talks?
Yeah, the immediate goal is to secure the release of the remaining hostages. Beyond that, there's speculation about a broader deal to end the war. Now, this is, as always, delicate balancing act as the Middle East seems to be. Israel has been consulted on these talks, but there is some concern even in Israel that direct U.S. engagement with Hamas could complicate Israel's own efforts to recover its citizens.
So now Israel's kind of getting pause.
Yep. There are now actual cracks in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and I want to get to that sort of crack in those relations a little later when we talk about Iran's nuclear program.
Okay. Then, before we get to the talk about Iran, can you provide any insights into Israel's stance on these direct talks with Hamas?
Well, Israel's prime minister, that's Benjamin Netanyahu, his office has said it has, quote, expressed its position, end quote.
They've also acted on their position.
Well, for this particularly, they've expressed its position to the U.S. on the matter, but they're not providing any details on what they've expressed to the United States about their thoughts on the position. Now, look, obviously, Israel is a little wary of any negotiations that could undermine its military objectives. Its military objective is the annihilation of Hamas. And it might be a little wary of its own efforts to recover their own hostages.
All right, Kerbin, let's talk about what the broader implications of Trump's threats in the U.S. engaging directly with Hamas are. What do you think those could be?
I mean, all it does is add a layer of volatility to the situation. His rhetoric might embolden Israel to take more aggressive actions. That would definitely jeopardize the ceasefire and the end to this war.
But if there's cracks in our relations, then maybe they don't quite believe everything that Trump's saying either, you know?
Exactly. And so on that end, that direct engagement with Hamas, it's a significant departure from U.S. policy, longstanding U.S. policy. And that could set a precedent for future conflicts. If the U.S. is going to negotiate with Hamas, what's Hezbollah do now? What do the Houthis do if they're going to get their people an ear to the President of the United States? It also highlights Qatar's role. They've been mediating all of this. And so where do they fit in these negotiations?
Okay, so do you think Trump's approach will have any impact on the actual hostage situation?
It's really tough for me to say. Look, statements like this from Trump are often less about the exact words. Like I said, I think he's setting the stage for a victory. He is probably aiming for a scenario where Hamas releases just the U.S. hostages, those 5 U.S. hostages, and he could then present to the American people, this is another victory of the Trump administration, the best administration since George Washington.
Since King George.
Yeah. And he would use that as proof of his ability to achieve results. And that's something you could say Biden didn't do. Now, here's the thing. If there is any misstep in coordination between the U.S. and Israel, that will throw a wrench in these efforts. So, delicate situation here. They've got to be very careful because one wrong move could make an already complex process even more difficult.
Well, we will obviously continue talking about this next week. But up next, we're turning our attention to a developing story involving Russia, Iran, and President Donald Trump. But before we dive in, we're taking a quick break for a message from our sponsors. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. As we hinted earlier, we are discussing a developing story involving Russia, Iran, and President Donald Trump. Bloomberg recently reported that Russia has agreed to help President Trump engage with Iran on its nuclear program and its support for anti-U.S. proxies in the Middle East. So can you give us some context on what's happening here?
Sure. According to the report that you talked about in Bloomberg, Trump actually expressed interest in working with Iran during a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So this isn't just about Iran's nuclear program. It's about Tehran's support for groups in the Middle East that oppose U.S. interests. One of those being Hamas, right? A proxy of Iran that the U.S. is trying to engage with.
Right.
Following that call, U.S. officials met with their Russian counterparts at a summit in Saudi Arabia to discuss potential communication channels with Iran. Now, what's interesting is that the Kremlin has publicly stated its willingness to mediate. Dmitry Peskov, that's Putin's spokesman, he said Moscow is ready to do everything in its power to facilitate negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. But the White House has not commented on these developments, and that leaves us with a lot more questions than we have answers.
They're willing to comment on a lot of things, but I think they know this is
a big one to put out publicly, yes.
Right. I mean, it's really fascinating, but Iran's leadership has been sending mixed signals as well. Like, on one hand, they've acknowledged Putin's mediation efforts, but on the other, Ayatollah Khamenei has doubled down on his refusal to negotiate with the U.S. So what's the truth? What the heck is going on?
Yeah, you're absolutely right there, Tiana. Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei briefly opened the door to negotiations with the West last August. That was the Biden administration. But by February of this year, with the new Trump administration taking over, he had completely reversed course. Now, remember, Iran was implicated on a few attempts to assassinate Donald Trump during his campaign for U.S. president.
Oh, yeah.
So that makes this a bit more confusing as to why his administration would want to mediate this.
Right.
Now, all that said, well, there's a ton of nuance here. One Iranian official told The Telegraph that Putin had reached out to Iran's Supreme National Security Council. He'd offered to mediate direct talks between Tehran and Washington. So, while the official line is, we're not doing any negotiations from Iran and from the United States, apparently, there is clearly some behind-the-scenes maneuvering happening right now.
All right, well, let's discuss Iran's nuclear program. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, recently released a report showing that Iran has significantly ramped up its uranium enrichment. So how serious is this development?
Yeah, look, it's very serious. The IAEA's latest quarterly report did reveal that Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, which is the purity that you need to create a weapon, has surged to 274.8 kilograms. Now, you put that in perspective, that is an increase of over 92 kilograms since we talked about this in November of 2024.
Wow.
This level of enrichment is just a technical step away from that 90% to complete a nuclear weapon. Now, for context, in August of 2024, Iran's stockpile was at 164.7 kilograms. So, in just a few months, they've made significant progress. This escalation is a direct challenge to the U.S. and its allies, especially given Trump's renewed maximum pressure campaign of his sanctions on Iran. So, it's a dangerous game, everyone. It's raising tensions, not just in the Middle East, but across the world.
All right, well, let's talk about Russia's role in all of this. Why is Moscow so eager to mediate between the U.S. and Iran?
Look, their motivations are multifaceted. They first see an opportunity to position themselves as a key power broker in the Middle East. So by mediating between the U.S. and Iran, Moscow can strengthen its influence in the region. They can also showcase their diplomatic clout on the global stage. The next thing is that Russia has its own interests in keeping Iran from becoming a nuclear-armed state. We know that Russia and Iran are allies, to some extent, that is. But a nuclear-armed Iran could destabilize the region in ways that even Russia doesn't want to deal with. So, by facilitating talks, Russia can manage the situation, but also keep the U.S. engaged in a diplomatic process that might slow down Iran's nuclear advancements.
So where does this leave us? What should we be watching for in the coming weeks and months?
Here's what I'm looking for. First, I think we need to hear directly from the Trump administration. If there's any truth to these reports, or if they're completely off base, they need to address it head on. Transparency is key here. That's especially true when it comes to something as sensitive as this. I also don't think we need to forget Israel. I told you I want to talk about this during this part of the podcast. They have a vested interest here. If the U.S. wants to maintain strong ties with Israel, being upfront about what's happening with Russia's involvement in these negotiations is going to be crucial. But here's the big question. Here's like the biggest question of all of it. What exactly is being mediated? Are we talking about a nuclear program with no oversight? Because Iran continues to claim that their nuclear ambitions are purely for energy and to benefit their people. If that's the case, then why not allow full transparency? These are the kind of details that we're going to have to watch out for over the next few weeks and probably the next few months.
All right, well, time to shift focus to the escalating tensions between the United States and China, specifically over the fentanyl crisis and the Trump administration's decision to impose additional tariffs on Chinese goods.
Mm-hmm.
Yay. Okay. So the Trump administration recently imposed an additional 10% tariff on Chinese imports, doubling the existing rate. These tariffs are being justified as a response to the fentanyl crisis. But can you explain the connection the U.S. is making between fentanyl and these tariffs?
Yeah, look, the U.S. government under the Trump administration has been pointing to China as a major source of fentanyl and its precursors. This is not fake. That's not fake news, guys. China is the major source of not fentanyl, but those precursors to create fentanyl.
I don't even know what fentanyl's made out of.
I couldn't really tell you right now either, but
That's okay.
China is exporting these precursors to Latin America, to the cartels.
So they can make fentanyl.
They can lace opioids with, or they can lace drugs with fentanyl.
Because it's cheap to make, right?
Yes, it's very cheap to make. And then they can move that across the border. And it's caused this opioid crisis in the United States. Opioids are very addictive. And there are cities that look like zombie apocalypse in some parts of the United States. It is concerning. It should concern everyone. You know, the Trump administration claims that China hasn't done enough to curb the production and export of these substances. In response, they've used tariffs as a form of leverage, and they've essentially said, if you don't help us solve the problem, we're going to hit you where it hurts.
You're hitting our economy where it hurts, too, though.
Now, to play both sides of this, just to show that the Trump administration is targeting China for the fentanyl crisis, just today, as the stock market was tanking, President Trump did declare that he has paused the tariffs on Mexico after having a conversation with the president of Mexico, who has said that they have or has shown President Trump that they have done enough to halt the fentanyl crisis and the cross-border fentanyl movement from the cartels.
What does that mean, halt it? Like, what are they doing? Is that something else that we don't get to be privy to?
Well,
it's not going to embarrass anybody.
So we talked about the CIA program with the MQ-9 Reapers, the drones that were... And what I said, whenever we talked about this, the CIA was using these aircraft, these unmanned aerial
Initially,
systems.
The president tried to say, I don't know why they're over here.
Right. And then the president said,
just kidding.
Just kidding. I asked for them. So
yeah,
this is what, take it from somebody that worked in this program, not with the CIA, but a very similar program. When you don't weaponize these MQ-9 Reapers, what you're really doing is surveillance. So you're identifying what we would do counterterrorism. You identify a terrorist or a terrorist cell, point them out, and you get boots on the ground to go in and detain, arrest, capture, what we call capture-kill missions. So you want to capture, but if you have to, you kill them. So what the CIA is doing here is they're identifying these cartel locations. Telling Mexican forces, here's where the cartel is at. Mexican forces are going in, arresting cartel members. And recently we found out that a large group of cartel leaders was arrested and sent to the United States to be prosecuted. So I think that's part of what Trump is alluding to there.
Oh, okay. Well, why doesn't he just say it? Like, he's very open about some things and other things. He's very hush-hush.
He's a complicated man.
Well, we're all complicated,
we are.
I guess.
And we all don't always do and say all the things we want to do and say.
And
sometimes.
Obviously, being president of any nation is incredibly difficult and stressful. Like, whenever they when they enter office and when they leave office, they're just
they're
aged.
a different person.
Yeah, they're just totally aged. All right, so how has China responded to this?
Well, obviously, China's pushed back hard. The Chinese embassy in the United States even released a statement on X, formerly Twitter. We can call it X now.
I can't call it that. I only call it Twitter.
Yeah, well, you don't even have a Twitter, so...
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at social media in general, and there's just too many platforms to keep up with.
And then you had it. Well, you did have a Twitter for a little bit, for like 20 seconds.
It probably it was
before the Elon days.
Yeah, it was way before the Elon days. I think we still lived in North Carolina when I had it.
Oh, I think you're right.
And I think I had it for like a week, and I gave it a week, and I just didn't. And I was like, it's basically the same thing I can do everywhere else, but with pictures.
And when you, Tiana, delete social media,
yeah,
that's it.
Yeah,
you don't get back on.
No. I don't miss Facebook at all.
No. Who does? People on Facebook don't miss Facebook. But that's a tangent.
All right, sorry guys, we're back on track.
Back to the geopolitical portion of the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So the Chinese embassy in the U.S. said on X that they wanted equal consultation to address the fentanyl issue. They made it clear that they're not backing down. Here's a quote I want to say from them. They said, quote, "If war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, Taiwan, we're ready to fight till the end," end quote.
That's pretty horrifying,
yeah.
to be perfectly honest with you. And China isn't just rejecting the tariffs, they're also rejecting the U.S.'s accusations about fentanyl. So what is their argument? How are they just saying they're sending this stuff and it's our fault that this is getting made into fentanyl?
Yeah, look, they've been very vocal about this. Just what you said. They argue that the U.S. is responsible for its own fentanyl crisis, for allowing... So this is a dig at the Trump administration, or the Biden administration, I think.
Okay.
For allowing the border to go into such disrepair that the United States actually just allowed cartels to run roughshod through the U.S. border. They're not wrong. But I think what the Trump administration is saying now is, look what we're doing to beef up the border. Look what we're doing to secure our own border. Now, China, it's your turn to step up your game. I think that's what the Trump administration would say. Now, China is saying that they already took a significant step to help the United States combat the issue. And they say they did this out of, quote, humanity and goodwill, end quote. But they're also, after they said they did that, they told the United States, instead of acknowledging those efforts,
They're saying thank you. They're being disrespectful.
Yes. So instead of saying thank you, using the administration's words against them.
Vance.
Right. The U.S. is choosing to blame China and to use tariffs as a form of pressure and blackmail. China even said, quote, they've been punishing us for helping them, end quote.
Well, another bold statement from a government. So what do you think they mean by, quote, punishing us for helping them, end quote?
Yeah, look, I think they're referring to measures they've already implemented to regulate fentanyl production and their exports. And still the United States is putting tariffs on China. So China says they've tightened controls, and they even classified all fentanyl-related substances as controlled substances.
Oh, okay.
And they say that was a significant step. Now, you'll hear me say, they say, China is saying. This is what China is saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little different from what they're doing, which is exporting those precursors to fentanyl to Latin America.
You mean like the components?
Right, yes.
Okay.
The components of it. So that the cartels
ingredients
can put them together and send that to the United States through the southern border. Why? Because China is going to invade Taiwan. They know a war is going to start, and they want the United States distracted by a multitude of crises. One of those crises is the opioid crisis. So when you hear me say all of this stuff, this is what China is saying. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily what's actually happening. So from their perspective, the U.S. hasn't recognized their efforts. Instead, they're using the issue as a pretext for economic aggression. And they see the tariffs as undermining any potential for cooperation on counter-narcotics.
So this isn't just about fentanyl. It's part of a much larger geopolitical and economic conflict, isn't it?
That's why we're talking about it. The fentanyl issue is just one piece of this puzzle. So the U.S. China relationship has been strained for years, even when the first Trump administration was here in 2016. There's tensions over trade, technology, and especially military competition. Now, the tariffs are part of a larger trade war that actually began under the first Trump administration. They've been used as an ability to pressure China on multiple fronts. But the rhetoric that we're seeing now, especially from China, we're used to the rhetoric from the Trump administration.
I wouldn't say we're used to it, Bob, but...
Well, so some people are not, and that is frustrating.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, is like...
Right, with every word that he says, a new media headline comes out of what Trump is doing. And I keep trying to tell people, and no one's listening, to take what the administration says and what it does and separate those two things. Because typically, if you're reading what he says, I can pretty much predict what is actually going to happen. Just like we're talking about with Hamas in Gaza. You're going to have to release all of the hostages, or we're going to go scorched earth on you. Now, what he really wants is release the U.S. hostages. And there's some reports that Hamas actually is looking to release just those 5 U.S. hostages. And so...
Do you think he'd back off?
Absolutely. He did it on, remember, the Saturday. If you don't do it by Saturday...
And Saturday came and went.
Saturday came and Hamas said, we talked about this. He said release all the hostages. What was really going on is Hamas said they're no longer releasing hostages. They had agreed to release 4, and they're not doing it on Saturday. President Trump said release all of the hostages on Saturday, or Israel's going to be able to do whatever they want. Saturday came, Hamas said, listen, we're going to release the 4 hostages, They did it.
Wasn't that the deadline? That was the deadline
Yep.
for the first.
It was a week before
the
the
week
deadline
before. Okay.
for the ceasefire to end and for a new ceasefire to take place.
Okay.
And so what happened? They released the 4 hostages. Everything got back to as normal as it can be in the Middle East.
So not normal.
And now we're dealing with this one, which I think would be just the U.S. hostages. And then President Trump can say, look, that's a victory. And it is a victory to have the U.S. hostages released. And he can say, I brought back Americans.
Okay, well, we need to talk about China.
Sorry, yeah, we're going back.
Don't say we. You did that. That was you.
So, like I said, it's a lot of rhetoric from China now. And
I'm sure every government to some degree does the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And then also we talked the backdoor conversations that happen. A lot of this happens backdoor, where your rhetoric can be completely different because you're talking one-on-one with another diplomat.
Right.
And so there's not a lot of public pressure on you.
You can get fired up.
You can.
When there's no press around.
I mean, every married couple could probably tell you they will have very harsh one-on-one conversations. If it happens in public, that's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
And it could lead to a bad relationship in the future. But if you're having it behind closed doors and you settle those behind closed doors from a diplomatic level, you don't have the public response to it. So It's a lot better to do it. But now China's out in the public. And they said that they're ready to fight till the end. And that just tells me that it's more than just economics. It's power, influence, and also national pride.
So where does this leave us? Like, what's the likely outcome of this standoff between the U.S. and China?
It's hard to say. I mean, you know what I would say? It's going to be once China determines when they will invade Taiwan, and then we'll go from there. But right now, the U.S. is trying to use economic pressure to force China to take more action on fentanyl. That's exactly what this is. On the other hand, China is not backing down. They're making it clear that they're not going to be bullied into submission. So if anything, these tariffs could backfire, could further strain the relationship, could undermine cooperation on issues like counter-narcotics. Now, the real question is whether either side is willing to come to the table for meaningful, good faith dialogue, or if this is going to escalate into an even broader conflict. And then there's the Taiwan question. At what point in all of this does Xi just say, screw it, and go try to get Taiwan? And then when that happens, how does the U.S. react to that, both militarily and diplomatically?
Well, I guess we'll just have to keep an eye on this and see what happens. But for now, we need to shift our focus onto a story that's been making waves in the defense and cybersecurity world. Reports surfaced recently claiming that the Pentagon had halted cybersecurity operations against Russia. The Department of Defense has denied these claims, but the story has raised a lot of questions. So I want to hear what your initial reaction to this report was. What stood out to you?
Yeah, look, when I first read this story, I read it as soon as it came out. It was shocking. This was right at the time of the Zelensky kerfuffle in the Oval Office.
So it's kind of buried.
Right, it got buried a little bit. And so as all of that was coming out...
what if it got buried because it's true? And they're like, we told the American public that we're going to stop the cybersecurity efforts because of what happened with Trump.
Well, I will say that I'd say that's unlikely just because after the fact, the administration and the Pentagon came out and said that's not what happened.
Okay.
So that's why there is some conflicting reports to this story. But at first, I did think that. Okay. I was going, why is this getting put out right now? Are they trying to cover it up? And that's just conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat, Curvin, that comes out sometimes in the initial emotional responses to things. So if you want to have a conversation with conspiracy Curvin, tell him a headline he's not read before that's very, what's the word I'm trying to find here? That's, I don't know. I'll move on.
Divisive?
Sensational. That's
Sensational.
Divisive, yeah. And it has to do with intel or cybersecurity. Now, I will say this. Anytime you see a headline suggesting that the Pentagon has halted operations against a major adversary, and yes, Russia is a major adversary, that's going to grab attention. But as someone who's worked in intelligence for years, when I saw that, my radar immediately went up. Stories like this often do come from a misunderstanding of how the Defense Department actually operates. That's especially when media personnel who aren't fully familiar with the inner workings of the DoD try to report on it. So while the headline was designed to be shocking, the truth, I think, is a little more nuanced.
All right, well, let's break it down for our listeners. What exactly was reported, and how did the Pentagon respond?
Well, first of all, the report came from a cybersecurity publication called The Record. That claimed that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had ordered U.S. Cyber Command to stand down from planning offensive cyber operations against Russia. Now, as is typical with the media, that report was followed by similar reports from the Washington Post and the New York Times, citing unnamed officials. Typically what happens is the one journalist from The Record at this point sends it out to other media, and then they write pretty much the same story. So now it looks like multiple people are reporting on it. But it was basically just one and an unnamed official. Now, the Pentagon did deny these claims over the weekend, said that no stand-down order was issued and that operations targeting malicious, this is a key word I want to say here, malicious Russian cyber actors are still ongoing. So what do they deem malicious? We don't know right now. They even posted a statement on X to clarify the situation.
So the Pentagon is saying the reports are false, but is there more to the story?
Yeah, there is, and that's where it gets very, very interesting for me. While the Pentagon did deny halting operations, the reports also suggest that Hegseth temporarily paused some offensive cyber actions last month. Now, this pause was reportedly to avoid escalating tensions with Russia because of the sensitive negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Now, here's where my analytical brain comes in. To me, what this looks like, it's less about a stand down and more about a directive to refocus resources. So it's possible that certain analysts within Cyber Command were told to shift their attention to other cyber priorities as part of this efficiency initiative that DOGE is doing, the Department of Government Efficiency. Offensive capabilities may have been redirected to other parts of the intelligence communication, or the intelligence community, which is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. That doesn't fall under the Department of Defense. They could have also directed more offensive operations to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is CISA, and that actually falls under the Department of Homeland Security.
Wow, that's an interesting take. So you're saying the headline might be misleading to some degree?
Yeah, look, the headline is shocking, and that's the point. It's designed to grab attention. But as I would say, the truth isn't necessarily what's going on in the article. This kind of conflicting reporting isn't uncommon, especially in the Department of Defense. The department is massive, and it's a massive, complex organization. And unless you really understand how it operates, it's easy to misinterpret the directives or even the decisions that are being made. That's why I would have liked to see Secretary Hegseth make a public statement, not just something on X, to clear the air in all this. But then again, maybe he thought that's exactly what the writer of the article wanted, him to get in front of cameras and be questioned on all of this. And that way he can provoke a reaction and achieve some other type of goal here.
I'm sure I know the answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. So, why is Russia such a significant target for U.S. cyber operations?
Look, Russia's a persistent cyber threat. I don't think anybody would disavow that. It's even outlined in the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy. They use their cyber capabilities, Russia does, for espionage, for disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and even harboring transnational criminal groups. These actions are designed to weaken U.S. alliances, undermine the rules-based international system, and also coerce other countries. So targeting Russia's cyber actors is a key part of protecting U.S. national security. That's probably why it was pushed over to the Department of Homeland Security. But it's also a big part of maintaining global stability.
And U.S. Cyber Command plays a big role in that, right?
Absolutely. U.S. Cyber Command oversees 135 cyber mission force teams. They are essentially the action arm of the U.S. cyber operations. Now, these teams are responsible for both defensive and offensive cyber actions. That's why it's very specific offensive cyber actions against Russia. But as I mentioned earlier, it's possible that some of these offensive capabilities have been redirected to other agencies like the intelligence community or CISA in the Department of Homeland Security. So that doesn't mean the operations have completely stopped. It just means the focus may have shifted.
It's a delicate balance for sure. So let's talk about the implications of all of this. If the reports about a temporary pause in offensive cyber actions are true, what does that mean for U.S. strategy in the region?
Well, if it is true and they haven't been moved to another department, it suggests that the U.S. is trying to avoid provoking Russia while pursuing a diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine. Cyber operations, especially the offensive ones, are highly provocative. When we find out about them, everybody is up in arms. Now, a pause could be a way to signal restraint and create space for those negotiations. But it's a double-edged sword because Russia's not going to stop. And if Russia perceives this as a sign of weakness, it will embolden them to escalate their own cyber activities or even military actions. Now, on the flip side, continuing their aggressive cyber operations could actually derail diplomatic efforts. That's what President Trump has asked to do, is keep the diplomatic channels open. You know, it's a classic case of balancing hard and soft power at the same time.
Well, before we wrap up, what should listeners take away from this story?
Well, here's the big takeaway from this story. Headlines are designed to spark an immediate, often extreme emotional reaction. That's just the nature of the media landscape today. But we cannot let ourselves get swept up in all of this without digging deeper. So take a step back, look beyond the headline, and ask the critical questions here. Now, with that said, I think at the same time, the Trump administration, has a responsibility here. They need to step up. They need to get in front of cameras, in front of the media, and address the issues head on with a diverse range of media outlets. They got to dispel any rumors as soon as they pop up. They need to clarify what's actually being directed and why. And that's how you build trust with the American people. This isn't just about public perception, though. It's about giving clear, actionable guidance to the people on the ground. Somebody within Cyber Command thought they were directed to stop offensive actions. So, why is that? Now, I want to say, and I've had this happen before, vague instructions. Vague instructions don't lead to great outcomes. You've got to continue to try to clarify what your boss wants. Transparency and clarity are what's needed in this situation. That's something we should all be watching for moving forward.
Well, Kervin, as always, thank you for your insights. Is there anything else you want to discuss?
I'm good. How about you?
I just need to go cook dinner.
Really?
Like I say that every time I went there. I'm like, I need to go cook dinner.
They're like, guys, eat before you record.
No, we like doing it this way.
Yeah.
We like doing it in this order. It's like our routine for the last 3 years.
Over 3 years now, yeah.
Well, anyways, thanks for sticking with us, guys. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to This Week Explained. We hope you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.